Thank you all for coming on Friday the 13th. I just realized 2 minutes ago, so it seems like a proper preamble to Fabian Marcaccio lecture. For those of you who are English speakers, as we know also as gringos, Fabian, but really it's Fabian. For those of us who grew up in the deep, deep South. Many times when you do this introduction, always says, it's my pleasure to introduce so-and-so. This time I truly mean it. It's a true meaning of that word. It is a pleasure for me to introduce Fabian for many, many reasons. One, it goes without saying, his work is absolutely extraordinary, but also there is a kind of a much deeper connection. He's from Rosario, like some of us, even though I was not born in Rosario. My wife will remind me, I am from Rosario. So in the context of that, I want to give you like a very quick synopsis in which I think part of these things of what Fabian's work is and what he is, which is very unusual in many, many aspects. This is something I just found out 1 hour ago, that he was really into taxidermy as a kid. And I'm not so sure how to build it into the argument or what it really means in terms of the work, but I thought it was important to point it out, because anybody who has such an early attention to perversion, it had to be somebody interesting. The other thing I want to say about being from Rosario, and I think part of what it makes his work so powerful and so important and so relevant in many, many ways, it has to do with the idea that I think his work is truly the construction of new coherencies, and I think this can be interpreted as different in a very sophisticated way as a collection of misreadings. Fabian was not educated as a painter. He studied philosophy, so his approach to painting came through many other ways. But this part of the fact to be from a city, Rosario, which is the second or third city in Argentina, depends who you ask. And Fabian was saying to me today that he related to Manchester in terms of that this kind of a gray, suffering, corrupt city. So anyway, it has produced a phenomenal kind of a cultural identity. But also happens to be the place of the work at the birth of a couple of important painters from Argentina. One of them became really internationally important, but one is Antonio Berni, which in many ways his work was kind of into the early figuration and so on. The other one is Lucio Fontana, which is probably the most known of the people grown from that, and in many, many ways, he's one of probably the most important abstract painter ever come out of Argentina, even though the world culture claimed him as an Italian, but he's not. He was born in Rosario. And there is a fundamental difference between the work of Samuel Fontana when he paints, when he does ceramics and sculpture. And this is an important thing to keep in mind 2 minutes from now. But the other piece, which I wanted to talk about, is Julio Banzo, which probably was not a great painter, but in many ways, one of the best friends of Fontana, and in many, many aspects, one of the persons who influenced Fontana. And Julio Banzo, the reason why I think he's important and interesting is because there was something incredibly deep about the kind of emotional condition, almost visceral quality in his painting. But the reason why I want to mention him, it has to do with something else. And I recall this as a conversation in which somebody was asking Julio Banzo, what is the secret of painting? If I want to paint, how I learn to paint. And he said something like, if you want to learn how to paint, if you really want to learn the secret of painting, you have to paint. And he said this in a bar in Rosario, and the legend goes that my father was in that conversation. I never knew if it was true or not. But the reason why I mentioned this, and a sad way, in relation to this notion of being a painter. And 6 months ago, we were in a review, and Peter Eisman was there, and Fabian was there, Fabian Marcaccio was there, and I was there, and other people was there. And at some moment, the conversation was, and Peter Eisman said to Fabian, Fabian, you're an artist, so you can talk about that because I can't. I'm an architect, and there's no evidence of architecture here. This is more like art, so you're an artist when you don't talk. And Fabian said, Peter, I'm not an artist, I'm a painter. And he always claimed that difference. And I think that difference is crucial because it's the work of somebody who is obsessed to understand and reshape and build and move a discipline and knowledge that is a very peculiar and unique one. And he does it in a way as an amazing way to misread, but also as a way to layer techniques. And he incorporates a lot of digital conditions, even though the digital doesn't really become evident. He adopted the notion of time, messing around, like mixing silicons with oils and giving him like 5 minutes or 10 minutes to do brushes because the thing will dry. And he introduced me today to a whole new world about the idea of wet world theory about painting. That painting is all about being wet, and he will maybe touch on that. But this notion about being a painter and just a painter and nothing else than a painter, I think is very, very pertinent in terms of what we do here sometimes, and we tend to forget that we should say always we are architects and just architect and nothing else than architect, and don't feel so insecure about the specificity of the world that we work. And if you can see through Fabian's work, the world of painting is a gigantic one, and it can incorporate as many perversions and as many forms of inspiration that you can imagine, but they always have to be filtered to that specific knowledge. So it is my true pleasure to introduce Fabian Marcaccio and SCI-Arc on Friday the 13th. Fabian?
Thank you very much. Hello. Actually, Hernan have a much better accent than me, so the first thing that I have to say is like, I'm almost 30 years living in New York, but I still have a really bad accent. And somebody told me that it's getting worse. So I think it's you all have to do with the wet painting thing. As we move more and more inside our medium, sometimes, I'm sure that happened to architects too, that you think to yourself, why should I translate this into say something or write something if it's so evident for you? And you have almost like an indignation inside. How come to that client, to that whatever curator of architecture that doesn't understand or is not inside the code, you just say, why do I have to translate it into, you know, like words, let's say. So I'm going to show some of my work in general. This is a sort of introduction because I, like Hernan says really eloquently, I don't have a formation that is, let's say, like a classical formation in painting, no École des Beaux-Arts or any other. I actually grow up, you know, seeing reproductions of most of the major artworks. So there is definitely like almost like a way of trying to figure for myself how those works are, but you through a reproduction, you know that it's not the real thing. So that create actually monsters. I remember that I was walking on the street one time, and you know, like when people sell old books, no, in the street. And I saw for the first time one of these, not even a book, but a booklet about Francis Bacon. And I look at it, I stop, and I say, oh my God, I can't believe that somebody can do a painting that is just so horror-like, you know. And that actually shocked me, you know, and I think I was 15 or 16 year old. And I always remember that's the way of how I discover the work of Francis Bacon. And as you will see in my work, there is always relation to this type of, I will call it hybrid or constellational type of painters. This is a little bit of a kind of writing that I did to myself in a way of how I start actually like trying to actually situate my work in relation to, let's say, the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. That was actually when I really started doing it. And this actually show a little bit what I call my strategies, that at this point I call it paintants. Paintants is a hybrid word between painting and words like mutant or actant, a way of verbalize painting, and to somehow create a difference between, let's say, probably there is a possibility of seeing, let's say, classic painting, and then you have the modernist strategies, and then during the 70s and actually later in the 80s, that when let's say the first big revivalist effects of postmodernism were quieting down, there was a sort of a first kind of a feeling of uneasiness, let's say, because with postmodernism there was still the possibility of actually through revival bringing all kinds of cliches from the past, but in the end of the 80s there was actually not even that as a kind of strategy, let's say. I think in architecture, actually, there was actually a much more serious approach to postmodernism, or like it's a huge discussion, of course. But in the visual art, it was actually a quite revivalistic type of movement. So when I got to New York, in this, let's say, late 80s, there was this sort of sense of repetition through appropriation in relation to, simulacrum and all those kind of things. And I was thinking actually more about to set, let's say, try to reread the possibility of setting a new type of position in painting. And try to sort of go against this more frozen lands like appropriation and the illustration or the use of painting through conceptual art and things like that, and trying to create a kind of more of a new, I know the word, I always hate the word holistic, but a new type of painting that will not be determined by, let's say, formalism or idea alone, or the typical determinants of painting, like from going to minimalism to macromalism, from simplicity or minimalism to complexity, and so on. The transition between the analog and the digital, and I start actually working through this type of conjectural drawings. I call it conjectural drawings for the alteration of painting. And it was a whole series of diagrams, let's say, of things that are not possible to paint, let's say, like new functions to painting. And I actually start seeing the possibilities of the experiments that in the early 90s with biogenetics, and try to actually think about the idea of altering matter and the idea of altered painting or mutant painting. So as you see, these drawings are actually more like, they're talking about structural problems in painting, but they're like a comic book too. That actually relate to what Hernan says, that my basic thing since I was pretty young was to do dissection, taxidermy, do comic books, I do painting. So always have that in mind, because somehow the three things come together in my work in one way or another. And comics is about the way of actually creating impossible things, the onomatopoeia, the sound, the impossibilities of the cartoon, in a way, it's like it deals with like the impossible. Taxidermy is actually another type of impossible because it's to try to keep the dead looking alive, mummification and things like that. And painting is a little bit that kind of situation too. It's a sort of like trying to create a pictorial rendering or something that will last for a really long, long time. So those things, those specific thinkings mutate into my work. So taxidermia, comics and painting keep looping all the time. So these are all, this is an early 90s painting that is actually pretty, like I say, hybrid, because one of my first, I call them a series of the altered genetics of painting. And where, you have, the elements of painting in a sort of unstable kind of mutational way, like the stretcher bar is carved, there is paint, and there is photographical, that is covered with paint. So there is this sort of instability of the pictorial, the painting rolling itself, showing through some part, but then at the same time, not knowing what to show, if it's surface or structure. These are all paradoxical stages of painting. It's almost like if I was mapping to myself, again, the beginning of I will call it groundless painting. Like, I consider, modernism ground painting or grounded painting in the Greenbergian way. The idea that the painting is somehow like an spectrum of possibilities of unpaintability, let's say. Sometimes I call it too reverse surrealism, because it is not to use surreal, let's say, to use normal means of representation to do bizarre representation like Dalí or artists like that, the main course of surrealism, but is to actually ratify the code of painting and to somehow reorganize it. Like, for instance, this is a really good example because it's this rerouting of the wall to the structure support of the painting, to the dripping of a painting. So the whole thing becomes almost like rerouting the neurological system of a painting. And the painting is somehow not really considered abstract or figurative. It's more almost like a test, like in the idea that is sort of kind of floating in almost like the painting was catch in a moment of mutation. Like if you see it in another moment, maybe it coagulates into something else. So these are actually paintings in that series that were the altered genetic of painting. See, they are this sort of functional dysfunction. Something that was really interesting to me too, because most of I was actually seeing strategies like from the ideas of mutual equivalences of Mondrian, where he created this stable, almost calming echo from the pictorial structure to the support, to the wall, and into an echo to the architecture. This painting actually is the opposite. Instead of being a mutual understanding of itself and the surrounding, it's actually attacking the architecture, breaking part, but at the same time dragging the wall and the architecture into some kind of mutual betrayal. Like the painting is betraying itself, like some kind of illness or a kind of something that you catch the painting making, like a reaccommodation, let's say. Some other examples this type of, these sort of marks are actually that you see on the space in the middle of the painting are actually, one of the panels is made out of plaster and pigment, so when the panel is dragged literally against the wall, it creates a residual gesture. So it's not really about the gesture of the artist, but more how a handicap gesture, like the scratching of the panel against the wall could create this residual gesture. Now again, this function as function. Again, this is a skyfold kind of painting. There was this floor painting where the painting was like a tool to make that gesture. So again, the painting making a gesture and catching the light. This is, again, pretty paradigmatic from this moment, because it's a simple painting where you think that you are seeing a kind of macro version of a small gesture that just drip. But the drip, the painting creates this sort of phantasmatic type of activity where there is a rerouting of its energies. And I was really interested about relooping and recycling. Actually, it was not that fashionable right now in the 90s. It was this sort of a way that the painting is catching itself and reflowing. The gesture is somehow reflowing into itself. Again, the same thing, for instance, but with the ground. Like, if you probably see this painting, somehow this strange relation, breaching relation between the linear system, the brush marks, and the ground will eventually knit the ground. Like if it's a sort of microscopic reconnection between. So the drawing is not really, like the lines are not really drawings, but they're kind of like line to fiber connections. And I was actually, like I always do, I always say that there are painters that make paintings to, because they want to make decoration, or they want to do a pleasing thing, or they want to represent something, or whatever reason they have. To me, I have curiosities about seeing a new pictorial activity. I don't care about the object, or sometimes my paintings are a panel, sometimes it's an environmental painting that is huge, sometimes it's an animation. So it's a way to see painting in groundlessness, or in different grounds, or shifting, let's say, and thinking about painting as the process of thinking about painting, the realization of painting, and the conceptualization of painting come all together. This is, for instance, again, like a traveling brush mark that, abstract expressionism and all this, like essential brick element of painting is somehow dividing into this medium to an extra break of color. Like if the painting from the left to the right somehow is losing dimensions but winning other dimensions, or advancing through grounds in an enigmatic way, like, or in a phantasmagoric or eerie way. So these are actually this is actually how I started actually modifying support. So I started using actually the supports of, like when you go camping, pretty much, like this sort of, like a pancarta or banner-like structure, in order to literalize more the topography of the surface. And I keep working on this sort of altered pictorial things. Some people start seeing this painting as sort of like, people will actually tell me there are abstract expressionist painting for a video game generation. And I always thought that was pretty sweet. Because I was thinking, interested about this passage of the gesture, the actual gestures that we got so used to in the 20th century, to digital gestures. And I started actually getting extended into quasi-abstract material or generic materials in painting toward sign materials. Like for instance, I was really interested about like how, let's say, different models, like for instance, ideological, evolutional models will relate to pictorial models. And that actually is something that actually keep expanding in my work. That's why I, in later works, I start collaborating with some artists like Greg Lynn, for instance, or some musicians, especially composers, because I was really interested about to relate pictorial models with other, let's say, thinking models. This is actually the first collaboration that we did, 2 collaborations with, actually 3 collaborations with Greg Lynn, but one that it didn't happen. This was actually the first collaboration that we did in the Secession building in Vienna. He did this wonderful structure, and I hung clothing in them. I thought that was actually really funny because that shows actually how we actually, the misunderstandings became actually a really interesting part of the painting, actually. But it was really interesting because the whole reading, the pictorial reading, the time reading of a painting was really different as the reinterpretation of Greg like a pinball machine of the Secession. We tried to somehow get this sort of flow of the ball of the Secession, getting inside the building and sort of suck the building to inside out. So it was actually quite interesting because it totally the whole building got rerouted. And as you went through, you have these pictorial and architectonic issues going on. And none of them were actually colliding with each other. Well, they were not let's say, oppressing each other, but they were actually living in their own way and at the same time living together. So that was the plan. And then this is something that I did, like I said, well, I did this thing with Greg, so I said, I have to keep doing big things. This was actually one of my first environmental paintings. And again, this is actually a quite interesting thing because when we talk with Greg, we always work, I think there was a strategy how to do the things, but at the same time there was a tactical movement. And that was actually like accepting changes, let's say, as we did the work. And to me, that was actually quite interesting because the specificities of architecture and painting remain, but at the same time, there was a collaboration instead of like a multimedia. I never liked how do you call it, crossover. I can't stand that word, crossover art or multimedia art. I always thought that, they really don't make sense, those categories. I think that there is always a growing from within the mediums, and at the same time a collaboration at a certain point, and then a split. So it's almost like the notion of a solidarity of non-relations. That is a pretty weird thing to say, but there is a kind of a connection, but a disconnection at the same time. So this was actually, it was called Paint and Stories. This exhibition, I did it with a really nice article within the catalog of Jeffrey Kipnis, where he talked about this as a sort of one of the first truly 25th century piece, because he was trying to actually, I started actually like from the early work, the cinematic or the animational thing, I start needing a space to develop. And I would start thinking actually about the cinematic in a way of saying like, instead of imitating, let's say, film, how a painting could be extended to be temporal. And at the same time reading, this kind of not being determined like a mural, that a mural in general is determined by the architecture, but it actually will be a sort of passage through the architecture. This is a little low quality video that is shot like in, I don't know, the with a super small little camera. But just to give you an idea where this painting is actually, as you see, sometimes there is a continuity, but then the painting itself opens up and the train is coming. So it's a truly kind of urban painting. It was done in relation to the street, and it relates these sort of elements of, okay, film, painting, graffiti, mural, all these kind of categories to try to do something that is a little more sophisticated than these things in separated, without taking out of these things, because I love the activity of graffiti, and I love film, and I love panel paintings, but to somehow to push painting in this in and out of the building, depending but attacking the building, curtain wall kind of painting, or like a sort of like a folding painting that is actually creating a passage that go with you for a while. To me, that was quite interesting because in general, even if paintings are big, or even if you see a painting in a lobby, there is still, well, there is the edge, there is that. So again, in this painting, there is edge, there is a limit, but they occupy more space, and the compositional process is more interpretations, actually, of, fade in, fade out, cut, paste. They're actually using the editing of computing in order to create this sort of frozen-like movie, or somehow expansion of the space to a space-time situation, or space-time and material, because one of the things that is really difficult to see in these pieces is the materiality, or the discontinuous materiality, because there is always digital printing, large-size digital printing, but at the same time, they were already painted material, and the printing was territorialized on top of these materialities, and then new materialities playing within the dematerialized thing. So they work all the time in this sort of, you could see a little bit on the white. They materialize and dematerialize constantly. Like this sort of ghost-like. So I guess I'm going to rush because these are really low, meandering through the. And again, that's the interesting thing because, with a camera, you never know what to do in front of them. So that's kind of, it makes it interesting because the experience of the architectural space and the paintings is much more interesting than the camera going through. So that means that maybe they do something. So, okay, so this was the Daros Foundation in Zurich, actually. I'm sorry that I'm a little bit sketchy on my, okay, next. Well, too many movies. Okay, so this is another of these. And the flexibility of these paintings were quite interesting because like a movie, if I would have another, they were not really site-specific too. That was, to me, was still a notion that is too 20th century about that related to minimalism, about this pristine realization of the ground and the thing in itself. These paintings are actually more multiple ground. Pretty much, they have the enthusiasm of the beginning of the internet and the possibility of the multiple site or multidimensional. So I wanted to really emphasize that because now we take it for granted, but they were a little bit like a website or like the whole, like 1,000 of websites coming together into a micro-macro situation in real time, in real space. So there is this sort of, they are there, but they are multiple sides. So this painting is the same painting that you saw on the other side, but it is made all around you, like in this sort of new spatial configuration. And this is the second project that we did with Greg Lin, where I think we got a little more sophisticated in the way of integrated certain things about, the skin, the curtain wall of the architecture and the skin of the painting, the transparency, physical invasion of the space, many other issues. And that was The Predator. And we did it for the Wexner Center, curated by Jeffrey Kivnes too. And Jeffrey Kivnes always say that it's quite interesting because he is somebody who he have incredible love for certain pictorial models, but his graph, of course, is much more powerful than the architectural world because there is a certain sobriety in his care that is too immense, the whole thing, to do. So he's almost shy into the visual art world, even though he have incredible things to say. And one of my missions was always to say, you got to be in the middle. You have to do more for the visual art world. But it is so immense, let's say, the two domains, that I always have a feeling that he has a certain humbleness, and he's, of course, much more on the architectural side. This is actually the plan that we work for the Predator. The Predator was pretty much digitally printed on CNC styrofoam elements that were actually vacuum formed. So what you're seeing is pretty much this shell-like image skins, in a way, that actually were advancing in different parts through the whole structure. Then the Predator ended up in Frankfurt, in the Museum of Modern Art of Frankfurt. It's an interior shot. And a little movie. The little movie was actually in Urban, I think, if I remember well. We have it at Urban in Los Angeles, actually. Okay, so there we go. All right. So again, another case. This one is called multiple sites. This was actually shown in the Documenta 11, and it was. They asked me to choose a site, and I say, well, I would like to have a site where it will be transitional. And the curator, Okwui Anderson, give me one of the, how do you call it? From one room to the other, a corridor, and a narrow corridor. And I say, like, I couldn't say to him that he didn't understand my work at all, of course. So I had to be really polite. So I took the painting to the parking lot. And I prefer actually to do it in the parking lot than to do it in this corridor, because, these paintings are independent from the wall. They are actually meander through space. You have to see them in a kind of, through your walking, let's say. They make sense through your walking. And so the piece ended up a little bit outside of the Documenta, as a kind of parking lot piece that I thought that was quite interesting, because there were actually dogs, going around. But there was like a strange traffic. I mean, cars coming around. And again, I thought that was an interesting, because I always thought that these paintings could be like urban paintings instead of being mural, and they could be a sort of something that is between film, architecture, and painting, and they can sort of, again, that ontological thing that the painting doesn't stop you, but actually you walk with the painting for a while, so you get to make sense of certain things, and the painting somehow doesn't stop you like a film in a dark room or something like that, but you liberally go your life, and you passage my painting in a while, you get something, and then you keep going, and the painting goes the other way. So it's more like viewing a painting as you go. Like you live and the painting, you don't have to stop. It doesn't steal you, your time in a way. So those are some areas. I don't know if I could talk. I mean, I had to go a little bit faster. What time is, what is the? 45? Oh, so I've been talking like for half hour? Okay, that's not bad. 25? Oh, okay, that's not bad. This was actually one of my favorite actually of these environmental paintings, because here you see the plan. A crazy curator in Belgium did. Belgium is actually really fascinated with the sea because Ensor and the North Sea and the whole artists like Lionel Spillert and Ensor and all these things, and they have this really interesting relation to the seascape. And there was this curator that saw one of my environmental paintings, and he invited me to. He asked me, "Do you think that you can see? Can you do a seascape?" And I said, "That's interesting." I mean, after Turner and after so many great things that happened. And I said, well, only if I could make a seascape in real time. So a seascape that you could actually just walk for 20 minutes as you walk and meander and thinking in the beach. And this is how this painting came about. And it's kind of narrow. It's like a meter high, suspended by poles that went all the way into the sand, because the North Sea have really long tides, like a really fast tides. The tides go really fast. So sometimes the painting will be covered by water, and sometimes you could walk on the beach. So this is one of my favorite pieces actually, because the high was not really hiding the side. It was like a pictorial deployment that was doing its thing without hiding the actual site. And it was kind of like 20 meters, then there was a break, like here, and you can go and re-edit the chapters of the painting as you walk. And people would do things like this, like just walk and chill out. And it was quite interesting because people don't even pay attention to it. To me, it was really interesting because it was not about the idea of being attentive to a painting that is in front of you, but it's like, again, you walk, you have your life, you do your thing, then you see painting, and then you keep doing your thing. So it was like a passage into the participation of the spectator and the whole environment, and without stopping, just flowing through time and space. So that's pretty much, I call it confined painting, because that beach was really close to the beach where the Allied forces, so there is in the Second War, there was this really, a lot of dead and a lot of bunkers in the area. So the piece was a lot of reflection about, of course, painting connected to issues of war and limit and confine, and the beach as a defense line, and issues of ecology too, actually. So as you walk, some people will just go like, oh, let's go to that. And I will find them looking only one area of the painting that was about ecology, because their interest was in that area, and they totally ignore the rest of the painting. To me, that was quite interesting. This was a smaller piece that I did in the Miami Museum. What it was? Miami Museum of Modern Art. It's the one in downtown. And it was a smaller, like maybe 30 meters painting, and it was in a simple, like rectangular space, but the painting was creating this sort of fade, let's say from there, from the right, like a screen of a movie, took off from the wall, and then there was a sort of notion of figurativeness or skin or life let's say, or issues of representation, and then going into this dark, going to this dark. So the painting was creating its own enclosement or its own loop into itself, from white to fade in and fade out, white to black. So it was sort of like almost like an instant life force loop, let's say. And to me, though, I'm a fan of this piece too, because it created in really short space a notion of motion, let's say, or a notion of a pictorial event passing through. Also, almost like trying to map a life. Okay, so that's another piece that I did but it's a pretty bad slide. It was in Turkey, in a church. This was another, again, with that idea that a pictorial scroll-like thing could actually tie into itself. In this case, the painting somehow, as you enter into the space, the painting open up and give you a lot of space, and then it kick you out of the door. So the painting, in the end, let me see, there, well, again, there's not a slide there, but the painting became, as it moved through space, it became much more materialized, and it gave you almost I think it was like a meter, so a wheelchair could pass through. I wanted to make it even less, but for legal reason, we had to do it. So you had to kind of squeeze out of the painting. So the painting was kind of funneling you out of the space. And I think there was, again, another pictorial spatial relation there. This was the same piece, again, multiple site, where I installed the same piece into let me see if I have a better, this is a little movie, that's better. It's a bad movie again, but it's a small movie. The super materialized part, it went through the jail. Let's say this was a museum that used to be a jail that the Franco regiment in Spain, in what's the name? Salamanca. In Salamanca. So they turned it into a museum. So I create this sort of a space where instead of funneling you into the space, the painting will break from the, as it materialized from the, go into the grid of the jail. So that was that. And then let me see what else. There was another version that this painting was called a Seiza painting. It's based on, again, on painting, but at the same time in dialogue with an interpretation of a historical event that was a massacre that was somehow similar, worse, but similar to the massacre in the student campus in the 60s. And of course, there were documentaries, all kinds of stuff done about it. But to me, the curiosity was there was a major paradigm in what happened in that massacre. People went into the act. There was a political act, and people started literally one part of the reactionary political forces start shooting the people. Let's say, so people went from this sort of proud sort of festivity type of walking in to being literally running, against the floor. So I wanted to actually create that effect, something that a painting, you see the water, it was raining, so you can see the water. So it's literally the fall from vertical to horizontal of the painting, like a tongue, let's say, going down. So in the moment that the piece actually develop its content, it sort of fall into itself. And it was quite interesting because a film, no other medium could do this. So that's actually another way of seeing the intent of this environmental paint, is that maybe, yes, you can have a film, you can have this more temporal, but pushing a painting to somehow be cinematic and space-time because of the actual real time where you see it and your liberal way of walking in front of them, that could be an interesting strategy instead of the camera obligating you to go, let's say. Of course, this is a paradox. We see this little video and the camera again obligate you to see, look at that, look at that. But when you are in front, it's quite liberal, like when you are in a painting, that people look, they get closer, you know. I always been interested in the choreography of people do in front of these pieces, actually. So that's some pictures, you know, the nature around, the edges, all that kind of stuff. You know, the material versus digital thing all the time. This was another attempt that is a topographical painting that I did in another museum. I don't remember where this was. I think it was in Sevilla, Spain. It was the inside of a you know, courtyard. And it was like, this painting literally you could walk on it. So it was like, it was the beginning of the Google map thing, you know. So I wanted to create a sort of, like most of the environmental painting could be seen as sort of like a materialized website. This painting was actually almost like a Google Earth, you know, and you literally walk on top of it. That was the plan, some details. But it was a kind of, the interesting thing, it was like, there was this sort of territoriality, gestures, and a lot of sensations as you walk, and you walk on top of the silicone, and we put things on the topography. There was a pretty interesting, you could never really separate the fact that you were walking on the side, reading it as a map all together. There were like steps, and they were like cast shoes upside down. They were really funny, and you could walk on top of the steps. So it created a really strange, there were people walking. It was raining like, oh, that's a little movie that's quite interesting of just the walking on this topography. And there was a lot of ideological motions, of ideas of reflections about how, you know, how we think about this sort of like the ideas of ground and territory. It was really a lot about territory. Okay, that's the more creepy part right now that we are in Halloween. No, Halloween, sorry, Friday the 13th. Some people didn't want to step on it. So this was a piece that I did, one of the last one of these ones, that was in New York, in the Riverside Park, in one of the tunnels. And this was actually a piece that was actually like a walking tunnel, and it was, let me see, I think that there is a little video that is funny. Okay, this one. Again, there was a little video of me with a bicycle and going into the side. And sometimes like a bad little video could give you so much more than a fancy photograph. And it was interesting because people were really freaked out when they entered into the tunnel. And this painting was creating this sort of like parallel flow of pictorial, like a fall, like a vertical flow. So it was a cross of your vectorial relation, walking or going with a bicycle, you're walking, and the painting was kind of falling against the other side. So it created this sort of cross of the two motion, like the pictorial motion and these were actually cleaning them up. That was kind of nice. The park and recreation people were cleaning it up. Okay, so this was another environmental painting in there. Not so, a little bit more conventional. Let me see. This is another of these environmental paintings that were actually crossing in a diagonal in Mexico City. And you can see through the piece. This piece actually took me a little bit to the work that I'm doing right now. That is these sort of pieces that are actually more permeable, like they look like membranes. This is a piece that I did in Canary Islands. And it was this sort of ghost-like piece. It was happening inside, like, there's this Buddhist idea that, if somebody's about to die, you have to leave the the window open so the spirit can go out. And I liked it because it was right in front of the church. And actually that church was the little church that blessed the ships from Columbus that came to America. So it was a pretty charged site. So this was called Anima, and it was this sort of jumping out, an environmental jumping out into the space. Okay, that's actually some panel paintings. I'm going to go a little bit faster. This is actually what it came after the environmental paintings. I don't see after, I'm still active in some of these works, but there was a certain, let's say, gigantism in the environmental paintings that didn't permit me to deal with other issues. So these actually, I call them structural canvas pieces. They were somehow, these pieces were actually, instead of being like these unfoldings that were going through space, they were using the same technology, but using a little bit how we map in video games, or anybody who does a 3D, 3D polygon, and how you map, how to actually realize that in real space. So I will actually create a three-dimensional model of a scene or a subject. In this case was a UN. It's called UN painting. That is sort of like, it quotes the famous painting of David, The Death of Marat. And this is the plan, actually. This was a little bit before the craziness on color 3D printing, that now at least you can do small figures with that technique. So a way of getting a polygonal structure, unfolding it, working through digital editing it, and then structuralizing that mesh and creating shells and rebuilding it in real space, and then finish it with painting. So they were like, I would say, picto-photo-sculptural pieces. This was actually what's called private contractor, working with the idea of, there was this company of private contractor was called Black Waters, that was really present in Iraq. And to me it was quite interesting because, again, to relate to war, political or war models or scientific models, the work always generate echoes, and I was really interested about the category of the evolution of combat or like war, and the idea that, for instance, private contractor to soldier or soldierhood is a different category, even different from the normal higher mercenary type. So, these are different examples of these quasi, picto-sculptural pieces. This is a duet that was kind of one of the more creepy ones. There were this really like, I think this was actually my beginning of the 2000, let's say 2010, more or less, criticism of the art world. This is actually what I was thinking with this piece. So they were like, they function like a bust. in a way, but there was this sort of, this is probably my more creepy or more eerie type of work that I ever did, let's say. And again, you see, I mentioned bacon, and you see, you have this sort of always a kind of reference to it, and it's, you know, obviously it's one of my favorite artists. And of course, I mean, I didn't mention others, but I mean, I'm really interested in the relation of, you know, Bacon or people like Richard Hamilton, the British painter, or Gerhard Richter, the German painter. I mean, painters that, again, are somehow paradoxical painters. They don't know how to paint, or they don't know what to paint, or then don't know when to paint it. There was all this, like for instance, Gerhard Richter is actually a really good example of that, because it's almost like the archaeologist of painting as the 20th century closed in. And many people think that, you know, Gerhard Richter somehow closed the 20th century as the, almost like the Jean-Michel Foucault of painting, no? And I always feel more like a kind of opening up of the 21st century as a sort of more Gilles Deleuzian, like the relation that the claustrophobia that Gilles Deleuze fell to the kind of frozen, how do you call it, vigilar y castigar, crime and punishment, no? The archaeologically cold mind. I always thought that Gilles Deleuze is about still finding a possible way of freedom, even if you become a body without organs, no? This was actually like another of these sort of really interesting phenomena, because one of my hobbies was, of course, seeing this, again, like I talked in the beginning, about functional dysfunction. And I was actually following my two studios in New York. One was in the Bowery, and the other one is in actually close to Penn Station. So there was always homeless in those areas. And I was being really interesting, not only about camping, like in the tent paintings, but about this sort of diffuse lives, let's say, and things that actually you don't know how, and we almost even, we are afraid of them because there's like an otherness to it. And I was really following this, it looked like a kind of a Jamaican or Rasta homeless, that he will cover himself with plastics. And he will have signs, military signs, and the David Star, and he was like talking to himself, like it's typical in New York, that is like a not like us that we talk on the phone, but he was showing like the real Israelites, the real Israelites. And to me, that was a really interesting paradigm of, you know, a citizen, you know. And this piece is really about citizenship, in my point of view. It's about this sort of nomadistic citizenship, this so you know, like transformal, ideologically shifting, and with elements of religion that actually somehow is a big paradigm today. I mean, there is one of the eerie enigmas of our time today. Well, this one is a little bit more hardcore. It's like a CNN take, actually. This actually was I was really fascinated by seeing, well, this is what it is, actually. This is the end, I call it the end of time. Like, again, trying to somehow going from super, let's say, let's say formal elements to pseudo-pop elements in a way, with a kind of combination. Like, to me, this was really interesting in relation to, you know, quoting the beer cans of Jasper Johns in a contemporary way. This piece was done 6 years ago. And to me, it was really interesting because it was this sort of almost like a loop, like a yin and yang. And when the two corporations come together, we know that it's the end of times. But this was about, it was more like sarcastic in a way because it's really difficult to see it. And I don't think I have other pictures. No, I don't have other pictures. But it is I was interested about in the informational models, how the evolution of CNN, that it was actually like some kind of bad idea from the beginning, but it went to this sort of almost like autistic speed of 24 hours a day news, to a certain element of truth. But during the time of the work of Iraq, since they basically needed it to lie because they became totally official, they didn't know what to do anymore. There was a bad combination between the 24 hours and lying. There was something that didn't work. So of course, as we know now, most of the website and the kaleidoscopic way of how people get information is much more active than CNN, but it's almost like an archaeology of falsehood. And the case of CNN is a pretty sad thing. So this piece, I actually, it was a double falsehood because I thought that they were doing falsehood 24 hours a day, and some of none of the reporters die in any of these wars. And so it's a CNN reporter blow up by an explosion. So it was a lie about a lie. So these were like, okay, let's see. And this, let me see. These were some combination shows that, they were actually, I started actually creating, putting, panel paintings, environmental paintings, or different type of work, and I call it variant, but it's a little bit too complicated to I prefer, because I have kind of hybrid shows. I will actually go directly to my later work. These are all actually, as I showed in the beginning, maybe, methodologies. These are actually all methodologies. If you are interested, I think that there is a copy of this thing that will remain. So if anybody is interested in that, it's actually, they are going to remain. So they're all experiments of what I call plastemic thinking. That is, painting, painting thinking. Like with a machine, let's say, here you see, once in a while I have to reshape the work. And in order to, I start actually thinking of I start thinking that most of the world was becoming too digital, actually. And there are too many markers and not enough reterritorializations or rematerializations. So I start actually favoring an idea to say, what happened if one rematerialized an exaggerated way a painting? So I actually maybe I could go directly to this is actually a show that I showed this painting for the first time, that I call it rope paintings, that I try to actually, these paintings are actually almost like obsessively material. But paradoxically, they are all hollow. So, and they are as abstract, as figurative. They're sort of suspended you can see them through, and you can see in front of them. And they show really badly in photographs because they need the actual light, they need, it's just maybe, okay, this little movie maybe will show a little bit better probably, because this actually was probably you know this place, it's the Villa, how do you call it, Villa Estes, exactly. Esther in Krefeld, Germany, and the curator invited me to do a show there. So I tried to goes, you see, is an exterior-interior piece, and there was a piece on like a waterproof piece on the outside. And then there was a series of paintings in the inside. So it's pretty much the first painting show that I got back, I will say, into try to reformulate a panel painting. And for a long time, I could not make it. I was, doing the environmental paintings, doing the structural canvas, the 3D paintings. But in a certain moment, I say, there is a possibility through this, let's say, exaggerated way of painting, that maybe a painting. So I don't call them paintants anymore. I call them actually rope paintings, simply. I wanted to be actually more pragmatic. And again, it's pretty difficult to see them. They need to be actually on-site seen, because the color, the transparency, the seeing through. But it's really almost like exaggerating a small painting and blowing it up into a really big thing. So it looks like you are in a microscopic situation. So the villa was quite interesting, because it could actually create this sort of, temporary relation and, an echo from the windows to the panels. Okay, so enough of that. There are some pictures of some of the pieces. And let's see, that's actually a retake of actually one of the environmental paintings in Rio last year with an extension. That was actually my favorite, because I call it the bridge painting, because the painting could not go quietly inside the building, so I just jumped into the window and I got into the room again. That was actually quite interesting. It created sort of almost like a bridge painting. And again, another passage. And this was actually a little laboratory, or what I call paint and lab. That is something that I've been using a lot, and using the raw painting as a sort of laboratory. They're more and more observing new, I call it plastemas, like plastemic thinkings that are actually reviewing or re-territorializing things that I used to do early in the 90s through editing, but now I have the possibility of doing it in 3D printing. That is something that actually I've been involved in these last 5 years a lot, because for the first time these mutations could not be painted, so I will actually run them through software in a printed form, in a 2D printed form, and now I could actually work on them in 3D printing. So I've been almost constantly involved in this new pictorial. You see elements that you saw early on for the first time. So basically I was waiting for 3D printing. And I actually run my own machines, because I always feel that there is a side of my work that is about DJing and sampling. And I do the same thing with actually the 3D printing machines. I sabotage them or do all kinds of experiments with them through paste through them and playing with the G-code, and try to create layers and all kinds of experiments. And I think that that actually give me take me to a new sort of a stage that probably like in the next years you're going to start seeing as panel paintings, as environmental paintings. You see literally things that you saw in a ghost-like way in my early paintings. I am retaking them because now I can through 3D printing. This is just all kinds of hardware to painting device to sculptural element to I will call it that I am in a totally new re-engineering of my work right now, and it is quite exciting because I was getting already depressed, but I knew, I mean, like from a long time ago that there was, of course, a stereolithography and all that, but the possibility of 3D printing right now is that it became really affordable, but at the same time mistreatable. And that to me a really important thing because there is a hacker component to well, you broke it, well, too bad, let's get another one. And a way of like almost like a living with them. That to me is actually really important instead of the culture of ordering things up, thinking, rendering. I go constantly from the material to the 3D printing, to modifying the 3D printing, to back again into the digital. And it's quite really interesting for the pictorial, I call it the wet, because literally, especially, I'm really interested not about the pounder techniques, but the extrusion techniques, because literally they are literally like if you think about a Pollock, a robotized Pollock, let's say a dripping that create an extrusion that more or less build a topography or an object, let's say. So all those things to me are quite interesting. Like you see this mutation of a gesture and again, connective issues and all kinds of new pictorial devices. Again, going back into the ideological signs, the weave in between, weaving. And so, you know, this is a little bit of this sort of new tension or pragmatics of painting. And to me, and I will leave basically with this, I think, this is a possible installation that I want to do. There is, again, an environmental painting using meshes and three-dimensional printing, where I think that painting could be it is still and always in a restructuralization, but right now it is more into a micro to macro to restructuralization. Like I see it a little bit like as the metaphor that it is like a school of fish that moves around space. And again, the wetness of a school of fish. I've been studying literally a school of fish lately and seeing how when a shark gets into the water and the school of fish goes like whoosh. And I've been trying to create to treat these sort of multiplicities of pictorial things into this new type of environmental painting. And, you know, to be continued, because I cannot, I don't even know if it's going to work, but, you know. I always say that I prefer a really good, spectacular failure than a minimalist painting. Okay, that's it. So,